Dr. Robert Galway was born in Red Lake, Ontario, and as the saying goes, you can take the boy out of the bush, but you can never take the bush out of the boy. He's been a geologist, doctor, held his IFR rating, and like many of us, has been bitten by the research bug. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Galway.
Well, I'm Robert Galway, and I really must say thank you to the organizers for giving me a chance to join what I understand is your 9th Zoom meeting over the last couple of years. I had hoped in the past that I might have someday had the opportunity to make a presentation to your group at the museum itself, but it looks like that chance is going to pass me by. As a few of you are aware, I've been chasing the ghost of Roy Maxwell for over a decade, and this evening's presentation is a selection from the several of the aviation tales that I've placed on my own personal bookshelf, resulting from a combination of good luck and curiosity. But first, let me say that some of the content of tonight's presentation that I'm about to embark upon has had both a direct and indirect connection to the greater Ottawa area. And for a start, it's a little known fact that William Roy Maxwell's ancestral tree leads back to the Gloucester Township in Carleton County. Before proceeding further, I'd like to quickly outline the skeletal framework of this evening's presentation as it breaks with tradition. There's two components to tonight's discussion. One deals with the major theme of aviation history, but the equally important second component is that of telling you the story of the personal history of the individual that brought about that remarkable event, an event that celebrates its 100th anniversary this very year. And that person is John Mack, who I've named the quintessential prospector. He's born in 1861, died in Victoria in 1927. And here he is seen in his bush garb. In presenting this presentation, the slide that you're looking at of this oil derrick is a fascinating image obtained from an entirely separate source, which was totally unconnected at the time I found it. And the author was unaware of the details behind the oil exploration project in the Moose Factory region in 1922. And you'll see later of interest is the caption that accompanies this exceedingly rare image. And this leads me to the obvious necessity of outlining with explanation the main sources of material for tonight's presentation in order of its primacy. And that is the first source of major information and photography is derived from the William Roy Maxwell collection. Secondly, from what I've termed the John Mack and Gamble family archives. Third, the oil derrick photograph and a couple others from Holly Parsons in his Memoirs of a Forest Catcher, which is now in the National Archives, and a variety of CAHS journals, in particular 1976, as well as from Aviation Historical Archives texts writ large, including both the archives of the Toronto Globe and Toronto Star for the years 1991 and 1992. Appearing in a limited edition of the personal memoirs of Holly Parsons, a provincial forester, was that image that I showed you of the oil derrick, which was taken by him during the 1992 summer field season of the Ontario Department of Lands and Forests that was carrying out the first James Bay survey. And Parsons was in the first year of forestry at U of T that year and had managed to secure a job as a student associated with this first James Bay Forest Survey project. And he took that image totally absent any knowledge of the circumstances and the context of why it was in the Moose Factory and James Bay lowlands at that time. And it sat on my shelf unconnected for some time. And I'd like to call to your attention his own caption that he typed onto the bottom of that photograph, which reads 1922, drilling for oil, Moose River. This must be another first. And that was really a prescient caption that was written a century ago. And I'll come back to that later. Further, and in vein of the material I'm presenting to you, It comes from the family archives of the Gamble family, whose mother was John Mack's daughter. And that family gave rise to 3 grandsons, and here they are in order of seniority age. Hugh Gamble, a geologist, worked with Imperial Oil as a petroleum geologist in Calgary, now passed on. But surviving him are my good friend, who's now in his 90s, John Gamble, retired judge and lawyer, educated with his brother Hugh at Glebe Collegiate in Ottawa, Carleton University grad. And I skied against John Gamble over 50 years ago when I captained the U of T ski team, and he was leading the Carleton ski team up at in the ski area north of Ottawa. And I've known John for a long time, and I'll come back to a personal story in a minute. And on the very right side, some of you may recognize him, is the youngest brother of the Gamble trio, and that is Robin Gamble, the Shakespearean actor in Canada, who indeed had a very significant role to play in one of the Canadian documentaries on transportation history in Canada. And he played the role of the surveyor in the documentary The Last Spike, which is the history of the Canadian Pacific Railway building across the country. And Robin, who's my age, is in Los Angeles. He may be with us this evening, as is his brother, John, in Midland, Ontario. When they gave me the family archives, which was the result of a conversation I had with John about 2 years ago, he said, "What are you doing now, Bob?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to put in print the story of the first winter flight of the Arctic, but I said, I come a cropper, I just can't proceed." And he said, "Why not?" I said, "I cannot find a word of information about the fellow that started that project. I've more or less given up after a few years of digging in all the resources I know." And he said to me, "Well, what was his name?" I said, "It was John Mack." And the only reason I know that, Larry Milbury had come up with that information. And Judge Gamble looked at me and had a strange smile on his face. And he said to me, "Bob," he said, "John Mack was my grandfather." And that's how I stumbled on this. And I said, "What?" And he said, and we had no idea in the family that he had any relationship to promoting this first winter flight into the subarctic. And this fall, I met with John to congratulate him on reaching his 90th birthday. And he handed to me three ring notebooks full of Gamble and Mack memorabilia. And nothing was written in the 9 diaries and other material that I perused and scanned over the winter time, except when I gave it a shake one last day, one photograph fell out of it. And this is the only photograph that links the fact that John Mack and the Mack that I have reviewed these family archives is the man in question who promoted and chartered the flight of the Avro 504K. And here is the lettering on the side of the photograph, G-CAAE at Moose Factory. So indeed, the link's been made. I've been able to validate that this is the John Mack in question, the prospector that chartered this series of flights into the subarctic and the James Bay region on a petroleum exploration in the winter of 1922. And that flight was flown from Cochrane to Moose Factory in the 504K with 2 pilots, Roy Maxwell, the lead pilot, accompanied by Hervé St. Martin, the associate pilot in the employ of Canadian Aerial Services Company. I had, by that time, stumbled on the fact that Roy Maxwell, who had been thought by most people, divorced in 1927 without issue, had no heirs apparent or anybody that he left memorabilia to when he died prematurely at the age of 56 in the Red Chevron Hospital, a Sunnybrook Veterans Hospital wing in 1946. The last 2 years of his life were dreadful years for Roy Maxwell. He had what I now know was multi-infarct dementia and ran downhill over 1943 in the RCF service, which he had to leave and become hospitalized. And a final stroke took him from us March the 15th of 1946. And as it turns out, no marriage was documented in Canada. It occurred in the United States, was another marriage in the last years of Roy Maxwell's life from 1939 to 43 when he was in the service. And his son was born 6 months before Maxwell died. The father never knew he had a son because of his dementia and his ill health. And sadly, the son never knew anything about his father because his mother, the widow, Jean Rowett, never said to Bill Alexander Maxwell, this is your father's history and this is what he did. She lived into her 100th year and she kept to herself any information that she might have known or shared with the public. And I stumbled on him because I had made a correction to an ancestry.ca posting by somebody that had indicated that Maxwell died in 45. And on an anonymous portal, I corrected that statement, said it was in 46. And 6 months afterwards, I got a nice email from a girl by the name of Debbie York, a lab technician, Perry Sound Hospital, and said, James, Mr. Galway, Bill Maxwell will be delighted to know that somebody knows something about his father. And I ended up in touch with Bill Maxwell, who was 64 at the time, at Camp Borden, where Roy Maxwell had flown as a pilot instructor, etc. And on that occasion, he turned over to me material which contained memorabilia collected by his father and stored by his mother. And he said, when you told me you knew something about my father, I looked at the material in boxes in my garage, which has been there for 6 years since my mother died. And he said, I brought it with me today. And he opened it up. And there was 500 photographs, 400 of the negatives that had never been printed, and other material, which is what the major source of this material. And I collected that material and put it into a small chapter with other material about his career, because over and above that, at a later date, Bill brought me 5 scrapbooks collected filled by his father that he had collected of his own news clipping service over his career, which indicated, because of the clippings, 15 episodes of what he had accomplished in his career. And that book is the one that Tim referred to in the news with a clipping from the Buffalo Courier about the flight of the Lark up to the Red Lake Gold Rush in the winter of 1926. Red Lake, as you know, is my hometown. So the small chapter I put on the winter flight into the subarctic was informed by the newspaper material clippings in those scrapbooks, some of which had turned yellow with age. And I could never really do other than that with that material because I couldn't find out anything about John Mack until recently. And in that material was a copy of the Canadian Illustrated Forestry magazine, and there was no material in the usual aviation history now or at that time about this flight, but there was a new section put into the Forestry magazine at that time on aviation, maybe as a result of Laurentide paper bringing the HS-2Ls to the Grand Mare in 1919 to start the first air service, which ultimately became the Laurentide Air Service. And so I've been able to access the original material from that clipping, and that is one of the major sources. Wow. As you know, Maxwell is known to us because of his completion of the first flight into the subarctic in 1920. And this is the only image of G-CAAE which completed those flights. And this is where I have to say publicly and formally to Hugh Halliday, a great vote of thanks, because he dug up out of the archives of Canada and the National Library on file the report that Maxwell wrote called Seaplane Activities in Northern Ontario 1920, in which it showed that that flight also carried mail, which became the subject of an article by Chris Hargraves in the Canadian Aerophilatelic newsletters. This aircraft was owned by a Canadian Aero Film Company, G-CAAZ, Irwin Proctor, and co-owned by two Ottawa newspaper people, Blaine Irish and Roy Tash of the hero of the Canadian movie film News. You can't see it in this clip, but on the right wing panel compared to the left wing panel is actually the inscription Canadian Aero Film Company. And if anybody is interested in that aspect of Canadian history, I can then commend them to the book called Embattled Shadows, which is a history of Canadian cinematography and the best source of material on Canadian Aero Film Company, which competed with Pathé at that point in time. That company went out of business in 1921. It was the victim of arson because the company went bankrupt. And the family behind Buttonfield Airport, Sifton family, had money in that promise or that company. The second pilot was Joseph Hervé Saint-Martin of Quebec Aviation Film of fame. He was the pilot for Canadian Aerial Services Company, which is the company that Mack chartered the flight from. We also know Saint-Martin as the pilot that carried out the first Montreal to Toronto formal airmail by Canada Post on May the 5th of 1928. I'm going to shut that phone off. Now, just shut your eyes for a second and imagine it's a warm summer evening with a zephyr of cool air coming in from the nearby St. Lawrence, promising a measure of cool respite, when a haunting sound of a long-lost steam whistle echoes in the distance. And that's the early evening train pulling into the country station of Huntington, Quebec, in that small sliver of Quebec, the southwest counties east of Cornwall and along the US border. And on that platform that evening is a young, vivacious lady that caught the attention of a fairly prosperous looking older gentleman. Introductions were made, a railway romance was launched, and over the following year, it blossomed. And here we have the train the very next year pulling out of Montreal Station after the marriage of Josephine Webb to John Mack of Huntington, Quebec. By that time, John Mack was a resident of Spokane, Washington, and he had made that his home, although he was born in the southwest counties of Quebec near the largest town in that area called Huntington, Quebec. And Spokane had the railway reach it in 1870, very much on the frontier, but it had a Hudson Bay post in the northwest mounted police barracks there, and a rail spur that came in from Calgary. Well, who was Josie Webb? Well, Josie Webb, the bride that I referred to, was the granddaughter of an Ottawa Valley settler from Manatique and a great-grandmother from Osgood Township in the Ottawa Valley. Her father, Joseph Webb, had left as a young man to go west to seek his fortune in Iowa, but was driven back from DeWitt, Iowa, where Josie was born, to Montreal after American Prohibition ruined his brewery business. She therefore has claimed for residency in both the United States and in Canada. And who is John Mack? Well, John Mack came from a Scottish family that settled in the Chateauguay and the God-Manchester Township and County of that sliver of Quebec, abutting the US border east of Cornwall. And just by chance, I had done a geophysical survey of this area 6 years ago when I worked as a geologist prior to returning to medical school. I was looking for a silver base metal deposit in the limestone of that area, and I remember it well. It was a little bit of Scotland that was known to me as St. Agnes to Dundee, and the Mack homestead was just east. That was then Clyde's Corners and the hamlet of Athelston, just a bit north of Huntington, Quebec. So John Mack was a Quebecer and a Canadian. Although he was granted US citizenship, he never formalized it. And on leaving high school in Huntington, he immediately answered the call to go west, young man. He may have worked as a railroader, but soon recognized that his true instincts lay in becoming a prospector. And he was quite successful in this occupation, discovering at least 2 properties that mine copper ore in the boundary region of southern BC, near the present-day town of Soyuz. And just east of that is Greenwood, British Columbia, and Grand Forks of British Columbia, just north of Spokane in the US border. And the 2 mines were the Winnipeg mine up in the blue area, the Phoenix area, and to the southwest of that was the other more prolific property called the Athelstan property, named after his hometown. Athelstan, for historians, was the grandson of Albert the Great. It was quite hilly country, and John Gamble and his wife took a road tour of that area in the 1980s, and in the family albums have photographs of that area showing the topography being very rugged country and still traversed by long shutdown railway spur lines. In 1906, after selling the mines and arranging for management and long-term financial support from the royalties, John Mack returned to prospecting and headed off to the Northwest Territories. And this was the start of the years that he started writing and detailing personal diaries. And he spent 7 months in 1906 in the Northwest Territories, starting off from Carcross. And this year was to prove a very pivotal year, because on returning after 6 months absence from home, he headed back to Spokane, Washington by foot, horse, railway, and then steamer, and to receive in Wrangell, Alaska, a long outdated letter saying that his eldest child, age 6, had died in Spokane. The daughter, Josephine, age 3, had survived, but Josie, in her own mind, had decided not just to bury the child, but she sold the house. So he arrived home with a more or less a fait accompli, and going along to get along, agreed more or less with the decision taken unilaterally by his spouse that they're returning to Montreal, which they did in 1907. And from that point on, Josie became quite independent as a seamstress in the high society dressmaking business. The heir apparent in that family was the daughter Josephine, which was the apple of John Mack's eye. And she grew up to be quite an entrancing, enchanting, attractive young lady with an artistic bent, who attended the first high school for English-speaking people in Montreal, the Montreal High School with a girls section. And the principal was Isaac Gamble, and she went on to the École des Beaux-Arts, as well as McGill University. And during high school, she had a romance with the principal's son, Hugh Gamble. That would be rekindled in the university years. In 1925, she ultimately married Hugh Gamble. That's the source of the Gamble family archives I'll come back to. As far as John Mack went, life was more or less downhill from then. He was really pushed back into the bush. He failed in his efforts to become a gentleman farmer, a beekeeper, a real estate agent, and all that he was left with was his prospecting abilities, both in Quebec and in Ontario. And ultimately, he returned to the bush more or less on a full-time basis. And in a last throw of the dice, in 1922, he conceived of this plan to search for oil in the Hudson Bay lowlands. Now, this was not just a far-fetched idea. In the Globe and Mail in 1920, there's an article about oil talk being overdone, about searching for oil in the subarctic, and the Globe and Mail financial editorial page pointing out that it was all talk and no action. And John Mack wasn't going to allow that to impede his successful ability for searching for oil. One of the other things that may have attracted that area to his attention was the fact that an American naval balloon expedition had gone missing for 3 months, and they'd been found safe in the bush in and around Moose Factory in late December and January of 1921. And that occupied the press pages for almost the next 3 months, so much so that the prospector John Jones headed his dog team north in order to interview these people. Some of you may not know, but John Jones is very famous for having been a prospector and recorder of the history of the later 1925-1926 Red Lake Gold Rush. One of the other things that came out in the paper was the fact that the Globe Mail in 1921 and 1922 had published the story of an unusual bushfire that had happened in the James Bay area in the late summer and early fall of 1921, in which it was speculated that lightning had struck an oil seepage area in one of the river basins in that region and establishing a out of control bushfire of big magnitude. And so that was another thing that brought that area probably to John Mack's attention. But you can say, well, what persuaded John Mack to plan a search for oil in the Hudson Bay lowlands using an aircraft? And this is where this became fascinating to me, because on Judge John Mack's wall in his home study in Midland, Ontario, was a photograph that I'm showing to you here with an arrow pointing out that the man in the black jacket is none other than John Gammel's father's brother, Al, both of them well-known McGill University graduates. And here we have in 1922 in this photograph, Al Gammel as the accountant for Laurentide Air Service standing at the bow of an amphibious aircraft on the ground after a forced landing at Trois-Rivières. And for those people like Hugh Halliday in the audience, they'll immediately recognize that this is not HS2L. This is none other than the bow of the Vickers Viking 4 G-CAAE, which was the only privately owned Vickers Viking in Canadian aviation history. And at that time, Laurentide Paper had decided to get rid of that aviation arm, as they had no longer the financial support of the rest of the foresters in the St. Mary's Valley. And they made a proposition to Maxwell, who had come to replace Hugh Graham as the pilot, along with Gordon McCleary at Laurentide Paper Company. And they got financing to take Laurentide Paper's air service private as Laurentide Air Service. And the financier was Thomas Hall, marine merchant and financier of Montreal. First, they may well have suggested that he entered into the aviation field was none other than Roy Maxwell's stunt flying partner of 1919, H.A. Wilshire, who had been brought to attention to the aviation community and your own section in a meeting basically hosted by Ken Molson so many, many years ago. When Maxwell left Canadian Aero Film Company in 1920 to join Laurentide Paper Company as a pilot, Wilshire went to work to form his own air service with Adelaide Raymond in Montreal, the R&W Air Service, and they sold out their company to none other than Canadian Aerial Services Company that John Mack hired to carry out this charter. The major public partner was Brian Daville, but behind the scenes, not generally known to the aviation public, let alone the financial community, was the person and monies of Thomas Hall. So Thomas Hall had his one foot in the Laurentide Air Service camp and his other foot in the Canadian Aerial Services Company camp. And here we have on the ice of that winter, G-CAAE being flown out of Montreal. And it was taken up to none other than Remy Lake, east of Cochrane, in the summer of 1922 to participate in the first James Bay Air Service run by the Ontario government before they formed the Ontario Provincial Air Service in 1924. And here we have G-CAAE, and that is the aircraft that Holly Parsons flew up to James Bay in, and then probably took the picture of that oil derrick. And for you real aircraft addicts there's the loaning also owned by Laurentide that Maxwell had flown up to go back from New York City. So the Canadian Aerial Service Company was written up by Brian Davil after George Fuller had arranged that he come to your chapter meeting in 1976 and provide you a story on the history of that company that grew out of the takeover of R&W Air Service and the monies that came from Thomas Hall. So behind the scenes of this episode in the Arctic was not just Canadian Aerial Services Company, but the full resources of Laurentide Air Services as well. And the aircraft selected to carry out this flight was the Avro 504K owned by CAHS. And that flight started from Cochrane, Ontario, and the aircraft have been dismantled and taken by train from Montreal to Cochrane to carry out that flight. And that's rugged country. Here we are in the Abitibi Canyon in the Matagony River Basin, near where one of the major hydroelectric plants was ultimately erected during the time of construction of the TNO Railway in 1921 and 1922. And so here we go from Cochrane, and they took off from Lillibut Lake, and the details of this flight come to us really from the Canadian forestry industry, not the aviation industry, as it appears in their index of this month, May 1922. And so here we are today, 100 years later, celebrating in the right month of the publication of the story and its details of that particular flight, which I originally had found archived in Maxwell's archive, but these black and white photographs are from the full article, which I now have been able to access online. And it was an interesting flight. And here is the actual article that I have scanned. And if anybody wants a copy of it, just email me and I can give you a Microsoft Word black and white reprint of that cockpit. And here, just because Bill Wheeler was such a close friend of mine, and I ran across the fact that he was the one that published the construction articles and details of the Avro 504K, and I've included that sketch in memory of Bill Wheeler and his article with Phipps on the 504K in our journal. The organizational structure of that article in the Canadian Forestry magazine was introduction, a section on the airplane on skis, which was the first flight where skis had been successfully used after appropriate testing, the story of the flight, the return flight, and other flights made at a later date by that flight. In the clippings was the surface map that Maxwell had actually abstracted from an article in the publication detailing the survey and the construction of the TNO Railway from Cochrane to New Post. And clearly in that article, there's a reference, subliminal as it may be, about petroleum, because one of the portages where the Hudson Bay Post, called New Post, was established was on the portage known to the local Indians as oil can portage. And I have to say, when I presented some of this information in a conversation with Tim Cole in Burnaby this winter in February, Tim said to me, he said, "Bob, what made you think, what made Mack think that what was going on? Was it something in the Cree Indian language, or were there other facets there?" And it was subsequent to that conversation with Tim Cole that I found that the portage at New Post, which figures in the flight, was oil can portage, and the article about lightning striking oil seepage in that region and initiating a bushfire. So Tim, thank you very much for that question. And here we have the aircraft landing at Moose Factory in February of 1922 after Maxwell and St. Martin experimented with several skis and had a set of skis remanufactured with fairings outside the wheel housing. So when they side slipped through the snow, it wouldn't gum the axles in the works and allowed for easier steering. And the snow conditions that winter were quite different because it was one of the warmest winters on record in the subarctic in the winter of 1922. So on the flight up, they landed at New Post, tried out several sets of skis before completing the journey to Moose Factory that day. The historical references in the Quebec Vision article commemorating St. Martin said the flight took place on October the 4th. That's a misprint. It was clearly on October the 5th. And contained in the Forestry magazine's own journal are these pictures of the Canadian Aerial Services aircraft at Moose Factory in the winter of 1922. And you can see the area is covered in snow. And for those of you who might be interested in Hudson Bay history, that's the second oldest Hudson Bay post in the history of the Hudson Bay Company in Canada. And I spent a summer up there working for Indian Affairs as an orthopedic surgeon, flying out of Moose Factory up to Saskatchewan, Fort Albany, right on up the West Coast, delivering orthopedic health care to the First Nations community, which was really outsourced to Queen's University at that time. It was an eye-opener to me. It was the very year that Marc Lalonde ended up establishing the national energy policy in Canada. After the return flight, which was successful and carried out in 2 hours and 10 minutes, they circled over New Post, having been told on the way up they were out of soap, and Maxwell dropped off by handkerchief parachute new bars of soap to the Hudson Bay Post, a first in the annals of supplying Hudson Bay outposts with goods, services, and supply in Canadian aviation history. So what then happened after that? Well, firstly, the CN World Telegraph announced on its bulletin of world news that this event had taken place. And then there was a proliferation of news articles in the Toronto Star and the Globe indicating that airmen had fallen successfully, landed on skis in both the Toronto Star, outdoing the Globe by clippings by 5-1. And I'm not going to go through the story in any detail, other than to say that Chris Hargraves picked up on this article that said that the flight carried mail. And this winter in the publication of the Canadian Aerophilatelic Society's newsletter, published an abstract of this flight in that publication, because they could now officially put into the Bible of airmail collection in Canada the fact that this was an airmail carried by what is known as per favor in Canadian airmail history. Maxwell was quite silent about that trip because he obviously had been sworn into confidence by the principals that had arranged it. And as noted, that the return flying time was 2 hours and 10 minutes. And I put that up because at that time, the time frame to go in by dog team up the Abitibi and Matagami River drainage system into the Missinaibi River and on into the Moose River was anywhere from 7 to 10 days, depending on weather conditions and snow conditions. So compare 2-hour flight time circling and dropping soap to a week or more journey overland by foot and by snowshoe. So George Fuller called me not all that long ago, and Diane Trafford, thank you, had called to George's attention that I was embarking on this project. And he called to say, Bob, he said, I personally invited Brian DeVille to come in 1976 to the Ottawa chapter and tell you about the history of the Canadian Aerial Services Company, which interestingly enough had no mention of this flight in it in terms of any detail. And that meeting, in which George gave his only model airplane that he had ever built, the Avro 504K, to Brian DeVille by way of thanks, is actually published in the 1976 journal with the picture of the Avro in the bottom hand corner. So that ends my journey with a few just minor concluding comments. The oil exploration project of 1922 was not successful in finding oil, but it was successful in seeing a derrick built and drilling commenced that turned up nothing in the way of black gold. But this image captured at that time by the camera of Holly Parsons secures a place for this exploration project in Canadian aviation and mining history. But it's taken a century to show how prescient was his caption, as written at that time, encapsulated in white at the bottom of this corner, 1922, drilling for oil, Moose River, this must be another first. And I think you'll all agree that it's great to be able to celebrate that statement of opinion that's now 100 years in the making. After the collapse of that oil exploration project, John Mack returned to living on his own in the Val d'Or region of Quebec, near Amos, Quebec. He was really destitute at the time. He was diseased, disheartened, and in every way a very lonely man. And he really merits the role of the protagonist in Shakespeare's sonnet number 29, which reads, when in disgrace with future fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate. And in his last diary of 1924, living in a cabin in which the snow leaked in, he pens in his last diary, he was happy to sell his Luger for $2, not because it brought him $2, but it got away with the temptation to turn it upon himself. And then basically impacting that black boot of his was the news from a late arriving letter that his daughter, only child, Josephine, had eloped and gotten married, which more or less was going to take him out of his life forever. And he was completely separated from his wife, Josie, by that time. And something moved this man to dig deep into his innate spirit of never giving up. And somehow he crossed the country. He made his way via Spokane, Washington, where he no doubt visited the family plot where his mother and father and brother Robert are buried, but on to Vancouver Island, tried to participate in mining exploration there. And years later, they finally brought into development Western Copper in the center of Vancouver Island. But by the early 1927, John Mack was quite ill in hospital in the Royal Jubilee Hospital at Victoria, British Columbia, where he died on January the 27th alone, essentially forgotten by a lone friend in Spokane, Washington. He was really just 66 years of age. And written in the local newspaper, the late John Mack, who passed away at the Royal Jubilee Hospital on Sunday last, was a good friend of the writer for the past 30 years. He was one of the very earliest pioneers of the old Boundary Creek mining district, of which Greenwood City in British Columbia became the important center of 30 years ago. And indeed, in 1910, the largest copper smelter in the world was at Grand Forks, British Columbia, processing ore from two of John Mack's mines. The Masons, of which he was a member, and John Mack was not a drinker. He would take his spare time to go into the library and read. He was every bit the student of the outdoors. So the Masonic Lodge in Victoria took up a collection, knowing of his connection to Spokane, and they had his body removed from the cemetery in Victoria and reinterred in the Greenwood Cemetery in Spokane, Washington, where his parents are buried. And two of the headstones there are of the two children. There is actually 4 children buried there. Of the 5 pregnancies in that family, only one child, Josephine, has survived. And that's where John Mack is laid to rest. Of interest, I contacted the Belmont Mining Company in Vancouver and talked to the chairman and the president of that company as a result of a piece of information I'd seen in the local mining press. And here we are in 2022, Belmont Resources of British Columbia is redrilling the Athelston Jackpot mine holdings in the Boundary District of British Columbia, the very property named for John Mack's hometown. And the president of the company had not realized what the source of the name of the company was, let alone the historical connotation that leads right back to the grandson of Albert the Great. So his mining ventures live on. They're really a testimony to his legacy. He died really quite a lonely man, but here he is now brought alive out of the caves of history into the light of day. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention to my presentation. And in closing, I'd like to dedicate this talk to the memories of the Gamble and Galway's absent brother, geologists, prospectors, and outdoorsmen both. Thank you very much for your attention.